But of course, the biggie that I think most of us see most often from acquired brain injury, or the one that we're presented with, for which we really don't have an answer. I mean, with astygmatis, we've got null points, and for these deviations, we sometimes have prism that fixes the problem, or vision therapy. But the one thing that usually makes us scratch our head and throw up our hands is visual field loss. And so far, in the clinical world, very few people have anything to offer patients who present with that. And as a result, these folks get very discouraged. I've seen it happen where they'll be told nothing can be done, and so they don't go to the eye doctor again. Why bother? As a result, some other eye diseases can be overlooked. Well, today we're going to talk about a lot of research that has been done into the area of visual field loss and some of the clinical techniques that have been developed so that no longer are you going to be sitting there scratching your head or throwing your hands up when somebody with visual field loss presents to you. So how common are these defects? How often are we going to be seeing people with these problems? Well, the best way we can tell is to look at large cohort studies, the best of which I think was the Blue Mountain Eye study. It came out of Australia. It may still be ongoing, but it's a longitudinal study to see how different visual findings correlate with cardiovascular health and other aspects of health. What they found was that of the entire study, everybody who walked into the study, which dealt with a complete eye exam and a complete health exam, almost 1 in 100, almost 1% of the whole population had a visual field defect, a neurologic field loss, a quadrant, a hemi, something like that, and most didn't even know it. And that's going to happen. It's happened to me. People are going to walk into your office, so don't forget to do that confrontational visual field, because that's functionally important. They just don't realize they have it. Now, in a more specific population, stroke sufferers, it really seems to be age dependent. In a couple of studies, folks who are 50 years or older really were down there. They were about 8 to 10% of those people had traditional field loss, hemis and quadrants. But once you get over 65 years old, the numbers get bigger, and we're looking at least 25% of people in Medicare age or older. So that's pretty large. We can even average that out and put it somewhere between 8 and 25%. We can even just say 15%. And I think safely, most researchers feel that's conservative. So what does that 15% mean in the United States right now? Well, it can mean a lot of things. We can talk about two different things. One is prevalence and one is incidence. And for those of you who aren't familiar with those terms, prevalence has to do with how many cases of whatever disorder we're talking about are present in the entire population at one time. How many are out there right now? Incidence is a little different. Incidence talks about how many cases of that type present to you or present within a certain period of time, or how many of those cases occur within a certain period of time, usually 1 year. So we could say that incidence is how many cases present in a year. So let's talk about then. In the US, the prevalence of stroke, TBI, and all of those together is about 10 million. That's about 10 million people a year. 10 million people alive right now who have stroke, who have survived stroke or traumatic brain injury. Now, of those 10 million, if we just take 15%, then we're looking at about 1.5 million people out there right now with visual field loss. 1.5 million. And that's a lot of patients. Now, if we talk about prevalence, the people who present every year with TBI and stroke are more like 2/3 of a million, about 630,000. And these are fairly old figures. And as far as visual field loss goes, that results in little under 100,000 people every year that's happening in. It does tend to work more towards the urban centers, but some of the southeastern states are pretty notorious for that too. What's the bottom line? The bottom line is there are a lot of people out there with this, and somebody somewhere along the way after they had their event told them that nothing could be done for those vision losses, and that is just not true. So let's find out why. So what are we doing for these folks when they come in? Those of us who deal with vision rehabilitation, and even people who deal with rehabilitation in general, really have lived by a certain set of very fixed rules. And I know that's what I was taught in school. It probably was what you were taught in school too. God knows I run into it constantly. And that is, first of all, that the visual system is fixed after a certain period in life, at least the human visual system. I remember my teacher telling me that at 3 years, you really have a lot to work with. That's a very fertile rehabilitative patient up to 3 years. 6 years was a bit of a cutoff, the critical period, where therapy really is not going to be that effective. And after 12 years, forget it, the ship has left the dock. Therapy is going to be relatively ineffectual. Now, I think purists, people who do a lot of vision therapy, know that that's not true, but the mainstream is still being taught that. And especially when it comes to visual field loss from brain injury. I learned with no exception that once you've got one of the cortical field losses, you're stuck with it. If it's not gone within 3 to 6 months, it's never going anywhere. And the best that we could do is tell the patient that they have to accept it, that they have to learn to live with it, and just try to avoid things that they have a problem doing. The only kind of intervention we could offer them were compensations, just a way to work around their defect or to try to make the best of what they had. Now, a couple of very well-known examples. I think there are probably 3 strategies that most of us know of. The first is yoked prisms. That's one of the biggest things everyone goes to who knows anything about visual field loss. Probably the most advanced version would be the Peli prism system, and there's a demonstration of that here. You can see that although it does lend you some visual field in the lost area, it can be difficult to get used to. That's a real training challenge, but it does help, so there's certainly some attention to be paid there. The second strategy that we deal with is a scanning technique, and usually the way that most people will get better at that, the way that most therapists and rehabilitative professionals try to do that, is either through a system called DynaVision or the Wayne saccadic fixator. There are some similarities between the two. This is a very important thing for field loss patients to learn, to gain some awareness of their full periphery and learn to more effectively scan, be more vigilant about their periphery. Very effective, but it doesn't do anything to restore vision that is lost. So nowadays, now in light of some of the research that's been done all over the world, we're starting to move a little bit in our rigidness about field loss and about the visual system. The modern vision rehabilitation approach is now that the visual system in humans actually, especially after some type of insult or challenge, is flexible. It maintains a trait called neuroplasticity throughout life. We can change and rehabilitate the visual system through most of a person's life. Sensory loss, another concept, like hearing, like seeing, is not binary. Once it's lost, it's not gone forever. Guess what? It can be rehabilitated just like motor loss. We can rebuild it. And lastly, that portions of the lost visual field, in the case that we're talking about now, it has been shown in a number of projects that visual field loss can be partially restored through a very basic rehabilitative paradigm. So I just used a word that I've dealt with a lot, but not everybody has heard much about, neuroplasticity. Neuroplasticity, if you haven't heard of it, is probably the hottest research subject right now in certainly neuroscience. In fact, it's funny, at one point genetics was the hot topic where a lot of universities were pouring all of their money and all the grant proposals were going to genetics research. It seems like nowadays all of the projects that are popping up have to do with neuroplasticity. And I actually know of a lot of researchers in that area. Well, what is it? Basically, and I've got to read it because it's kind of a long definition, but neuroplasticity describes the ability of the nervous system to modify its structural and functional organization, in other words, to rebuild itself and reorganize itself in order to compensate for an injury or changes in its environment. In other words, to restore function, to get up and running again. I mentioned earlier about the visual system being fixed. One of the people who are partially responsible for that were Torsten Wiesel and David Hubel, who won the Nobel Prize for showing or mapping the visual system. They did a lot of work having to do with amblyopia and dominance and things like that. Well, later in his life, Dr. Wiesel decided to take up research in visual neuroplasticity. And he and a partner, Charlie Gilbert, really gods of visual science and visual neuroplasticity, found after a series of studies that rather than a cortex with a functional architecture that is fixed after a critical period in infancy, we find that perturbing the system, lesioning the system, for instance, can lead to long-term topographical reorganization. And that's from Drs. Charlie Gilbert and Torsten Wiesel back in 1990. So neuroplasticity, I had said that it was really a hot research topic right now. It is. I also mentioned I knew a few people involved with it. There's one fellow that I know up at Harvard University, Lotfi Meribet, a brilliant vision researcher and eye doctor, who I spoke to a while back about visual neuroplasticity and whether the human visual system was actually fixed. Here's what he had to say.
What we know about the brain is radically different than what we were classically taught in school or beforehand or historically. First of all, we always believed that the brain was immutable, that you were hardwired and what you had is basically what you had for life. If anything, you were going to lose brain cells over time, not change them. The second issue is that as we decided, or learn more and more that the brain does change or can change, we felt that there was only a certain period of time where that happened, what we know as critical periods, for example. So the idea was, yes, the brain does change, but it's only in a very, very finite window of opportunity, if you will. Now we're learning more and more from a combination of animal studies and clinical studies and also great advances in technology as well, that the brain does change all the time and throughout life.